Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today we are going to be engaging in The Fourth Turning, the kind of preeminent book by William Strauss and Neil Howe. You are familiar most likely with the ideas that come from this book because we've all heard the phrase, good men create easy times, good men create easy times create weak men create hard times, and hard times create good men. And to discuss this topic, I have as a guest Mike Glover. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Mike Glover. I'm the CEO of a company called Fieldcraft Survival. I'm based in Heber City, Utah. Also a prior military guy. Also contracted with the Central Intelligence Agency for a few years before starting my company in 2015.
All right. So, Mike, I specifically wanted to have a conversation with you about this book because I saw you had produced some content on it. You had produced a video on it about maybe a month and a half ago in December. And this is a book that I think culturally, many of us, whether it's gun culture or like the preparedness kind of survival side, many of us are familiar with at least the ideas that come from it. And it reminds me a little bit of a thing that a college professor in philosophy had said, is that we were engaging with the ontological argument, which I think was by Thomas Aquinas. That is like an intellectual argument for the existence of God, and it seems like it feels like a joke without a punchline, even though the argument itself is rather solid. And so the book itself, after reading it, I did not come away with what I was expecting. How did you get into this? Like, what were your takeaways from the book?
Yeah, I think my takeaways from the book is it just makes a lot of sense. And you can't really debate the points of history, especially when you look at the increments of time, especially in America. I mean, we're due to repeat ourselves, and it's just the basic cycle of life. I think everything ebbs and flows, and I think there's a rhythm that you could predict. I wish psychologists and paleontologists and a whole bunch of people would come together and realize this is basically human behavior in a 80-year cycle, which is a lifespan. As the Fourth Turning describes it, it breaks it down into 4 generations or 20-year cycles per lifespan. But again, we're just due to repeat the same mistakes. And in the Fourth Turning, which we're in since 2008, we're due for, an awakening after we collapse everything. Now, what does that collapse mean? Before, it was noted in the book, it was the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II. What is that going to be next? Who knows? But I think we're kind of cascading down a slippery slope, and it's a good argument for making sense of a chaotic world, I think.
Yeah, so it fits within a genre of books that I've read a few of now. And it's kind of like if you've read 1984 and then you've read Animal Farm and then Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, you get this understanding that although these books all fit within a genre maybe of like kind of political-ish, science fiction-ish dystopian future, they all have a similar, even though they have similar, like, or different, like, messages and environments. For example, the social tyranny of Brave New World versus the authoritarian tyranny of 1984. They all have this kind of dystopian future where the world is not, or the future is bleak. The Fourth Turning seems to fit within a category of books that I've read that kind of fit with The Calm Before the Storm, or The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zayin, or there's a couple of other ones. But in the argument that they seem to make in that book, we're right on the same page with history. At least American history tends to follow this cycle, and that cycle begins at the high, which we would see as in our like closest to our lifetime, the people who maybe the 1950s and the people who kind of came out of World War II, and during the high, so you had the high, which was followed by the awakening. So 20 years after that, we're starting to get into the late 60s and then into the 70s. And the awakening is a transition from the sort of unified institutions and trust in the society of the high, maybe the neoclassicalism of the high, and it's a descending, or it's a movement from the focus on institutions to the focus of the individual, which maximizes in the third cycle, or the third turning, which is the unraveling, which in this book, according to this timeline, would have been kind of the late 80s, but really like the 90s into the early 2000s, and then it would be followed by the high. And I think, followed by the crisis. And the first thought that I read it when I was reading the book, and it's the same thing that I have to keep encountering when I read books of this type that like talk about a cycle. Another one would be The Storm Before the Calm. I think that's George Friedman. You see this look back at history and say, we can see this pattern, but then there's almost this implication that we're going to continue to see that pattern play out. And it gets very dangerous, I think, when it straddles the line between theory, like historical theory, and model, as in, well, we've seen this happen many, many times before. And so we have now intellectual tools to use for what we're dealing with now and what we could deal with in the future. Also, there's a little bit of historical humility, knowing that, well, things have happened in the past and people have become blind to their own problems and so on and so forth. But the other thing I see it do a little bit is sometimes step across the line into what I would call like prophecy. And prophecy in the sense of like it's prophesying the crisis. And especially within gun culture, I'm not sure about you because you're just we'll just say you're a little bit older than me because I was a child of the 90s. I've grown up in gun culture that has sort of talked about the idea of a coming crisis as if it's a foregone conclusion. We just don't know when it's going to happen. And every year it gets pushed back and it gets pushed back. It's Y2K. It's it's the next election. It's the end of the Afghan war. It's something. And in the same way, I see the same sort of, let's just say, kind of prophecy engagement with the climate, like the climate crisis people. It's like every 3 years they push back the doomsday clock another 3 years. But it's not about, so what that means for reading this book is that like the first thing I was expecting to get from it was that it's going to warn me of the coming crisis. But when I came to the conclusion of the book, by their prediction, right now we are in the middle of it. We're in the middle of the crisis. We're not waiting for a catalyst to happen. We're not waiting for a collapse. We're in the crisis now. And the relevance to that is that I think just like some of our culture, or sometimes I fall into the attitude of assuming I'm looking for a crisis to be ready for. The book sort of implies that, well, the crisis will end and a new high will come. And I think in many ways, a danger would be to assume that which comes out of the crisis, the new high, is a world we want to live in. Because it's going to be a reestablishment of cultural norms and a reestablishment of institutional power. And the question that I have is, what happens? What do we think if that institutional power is against us? The new high, we are the outlaws of the new high. That's kind of been the concern I got from reading this book here.
Yeah, I think it looks at it kind of marries two things, which is like nationalism and American history with globalization. And I think those are two very different things distinctly. I mean, if you look at even the time coming out from the World War from 1941 to 1945, that was a world war against two countries, Italy and Germany, and Japan was added. It's like you start a war, the war evolves, and next thing you know, we're dropping bombs on Japan. And could we predict that? No, but it was a campaign that included a lot of different countries. I think this book tries to make the case that we're looking at our involvement in chaos and catastrophe, and there's a cycle to that. And there's a feeling I get from the book too that there is a period where things are too good. or seemingly there's an abundance of something and it can't be good forever. So there has to be an impending doom or an event on the horizon that's going to cause issues. I don't know if that's human nature. I don't know if that's human psychology, but it seems like it in a lot of ways. I don't imagine there's a fourth turning in the minds of a poor person in India, one of the poorest countries in the world, because their focus is elsewhere. But I think it's good as an exercise, as a thought experiment, and also to provoke thoughts about what we should think about, whether it's policy decisions, whether it's voting up or down. I think just being proactive and conscious and understanding of our history makes us more capable for the future. And something that these guys are doing, which most historians don't, they're using references and models to determine what that future looks like based on past mistakes. I think we have a lot of our American culture, and especially in our universities, that just look at it and go, man, we were the worst. We were very bad people. And that doesn't do anything for us for the future. So I think just talking about this potentially being leading to a tipping point makes us more conscious and aware that something is on the horizon. And if nothing is on the horizon, and it's another Y2K, that's fine. We'll just prove ourselves wrong. I just hope more people are involved consciously in society versus just kind of, being an autonomic robot in the background, as a statistic. I think we need to get more involved in thinking like this.
So when you say something like, people need to, when we say people, we're talking to, on one hand, we're talking to our culture, like just American people, right? And then on another hand, we're talking to, I think sometimes we might also be talking to people who hold the same values as us. Because the biggest, the concern that I would have, the concern that I have in the thought of what this book warns is that it has such a plotting element to it. It's plotting, PLOD, not plotting, where it argues that, in the future, we will be able to have hindsight to see what this cycle was. And I do think that the attitude shift that's important is to shift away from looking for the apocalypse and instead focus our attention on both the here and now and what that's building towards, not like the here and now as in become hedonistically obsessed with the feelings of the moment, but recognize that right now we're in the crisis, and the crisis isn't necessarily going to look like the Great Depression and World War II and these other examples in the past. But what that means is that now is the time where we're going to see what they even refer to, the culture war, the conflict between different sets of values, and whichever emerges from that will set the standard for the new high. And that is a part like that. And why, I guess, why that comes to Fieldcraft Survival and like what you've been doing and what I think I see gun culture doing as a whole is looking a little bit past the immediacy of the moment. We are ready. We want to be ready for the car crash, the natural disaster, the human-made issues, and surviving those scenarios all points to something else. I don't survive just to put another cheeseburger in my face. I survive because I want to raise a family and build a culture and be a part of something. And I think so often we kind of, we internalize, it's not internalize, it's too woke. It's when we look at history in the same way that you're saying, like we look back and say everything's bad, we forget that we're not the main characters, but we are the country. Like we are our culture, and that's been, I guess that's been kind of what's been heavy from this book. But when it comes back to the prophecy, like I don't see stress out generational theory as a prophecy of what the future is going to look like. I see it as a list of arguments and ideas that suggest this is how things will play out, especially when he gets into like the archetypes, which gets very like Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, which is something I don't understand quite as well.
Yeah, it gets a little. I mean, he even uses the word. They even use the word prophecy when talking about guys like Elon Musk and Bill Gates. Generationally, I think he's. I think outside of some of those, when we look at like what can we derive from kind of this concept or idea, because it is a concept, is we could do something about it proactively by educating those that aren't educated. That sounds kind of weird to say out loud, because it's like there is a division even in the gun community, for example. And when we focus on preparedness, what's ironic is we get both people from the gun community and people, I would say in this argument or this conversation, from the left, who are focused on protecting their families, but they don't know how. So they haven't yet been educated on that. And so you have kind of two extremes. You have leftist and call them right-wing extremist. And then you have what we typically do with at Fieldcraft Survival is the middle of the country. Call them moderates, call them libertarians, call them whatever you want. But what I've seen is a lot of the ideas on both far left and far right are, if you're not on my team, then you must be on the other team. And there's a division between us. I think that is what is going to ultimately lead to this chaos or potential catastrophe as described in the fourth turning, especially in this culture war, because it's certainly a war. And, you know, it's not a war fought in streets. It's a war fought in media, in headlines, in social. And I think from my position, we can turn a leaf by educating everybody that if you just wake up to the reality that if you want to live free, you want to live in the confines of law and order, and you just want to live a good life, like most people, I would agree, then you need to be educated on all of these things, all of these aspects. So I think awareness is part of our curriculum in preparedness. It's not just the gun thing. It has to do with like, hey, you want to be free. I want to be free. We live in a country that's supposed to be free, but we have all these things taking place. And I think that resonates with people on the far left or the left period, and certainly the right. Conservatives are likely already bought in, but right-wing extremists, guys who are like on the fringe, are not necessarily bought in because they don't want peace. They want chaos and calamity, and they want the division. So they've already made their mind up. So I think our job and our role, even in the talk conversations of this book, is to wake people to educating themselves so they have more information and more tools to make good, sound decisions. I think that's where it leads us. And, you know, whether or not they're paying attention or not is the question. I just hope they are. I mean, most of the engagements we do isn't training people on the flat range how to shoot into a paper or still target. It's educating people on, hey, this is the thing. If we don't wake up and do something about it, we might never get an opportunity back.
So this, there was a brief second where I think I lost like a half a second of connection, but we're all good to go. I caught, I think, most of that, especially with the difference, like following the difference between some of how like the right approaches this and the left approaches kind of issues of this sort. Whereas and I kind of want to stick on this subject. Sorry, this was not, you know, it's kind of annoying when I have to lose comms for a half second, but carry on, right? You said this phrase a number of times. One of the things that we can do is spread awareness or wake people up, or to, our role is to, in a sense, kind of function as not a harbinger, but like what we can do is we can help spread information that gives people tools to address address the problems that they may face. And some of those tools are very physical, whether it's, some of those tools are very physical, and some of them are much more like skill sets and abilities. And so this, especially when we get to this idea, I think the tool that I would want to be able to talk about is having a kind of a proper understanding, or like a paradigm understanding and way to think about something of this sort. Because when I hear words like spread awareness or wake people up, I'm immediately thrown back to Minneapolis in 2020, where I was living at the time, and to the kind of BLM time frame. The BLM mantra at that time was very religious in its wokeness, kind of wake you up. I'm preaching the gospel of the BLM, and it was this kind of liberation gospel. And it's so I can see why something like to spread awareness as a phrase or something to wake people up would be received with a little bit of vinegar. But instead, but I guess not instead, but it's not just to make it softer and easier. It's interesting because the book is writing as if they're warning about the time to come. We're now living in the time to come. We're living in that time, which, again, I have to go back to this. The first time I started reading this, I was thinking that I was going to be warned about an event. And I concluded the book saying, wait a minute. We've had the death of George Floyd, who before he died was nobody of consequence. He was no Franz Ferdinand. We had 2 years of COVID lockdowns. And then we had we had the '08 crash. We had the end of Afghanistan. We had all of this turmoil, which isn't turmoil in sort of a glorious sense. I would say that the chaos that we live in right now is extremely mediocre. And that is a different type of threat to deal with, especially when you're looking at like threats as far as, well, let's look at warfare now. You and I both engaged in war at a time where insurgency warfare was the de rigueur. It was the norm. It wasn't like we were engaged in, to what I understand, I came from Ranger Battalion, so we didn't engage in conventional style warfare with big maneuvers and big, general patterns. It was very much so like, we got to deal with this insurgency. This is where people are at. This is how they're making their movements. And the thing about insurgency warfare is it doesn't have the pomp and circumstance of maneuver warfare. And in that same way, the crisis that we're in now doesn't have the flair. What if the crisis that we're in now doesn't have the flair that we're looking for? It just happens while we're asleep. And we're asleep at the wheel because we're constantly looking for it to happen. So yeah, how would you what does awareness look like? That's a good question for me. Because I want to, is it having a clean firearm? Is it knowing how to tie my shoes? Is it having a gas tank full of gas? How do you see awareness look like? And what's the objective?
Yeah, I think the objective for us, and this kind of ties in what you're saying as well, we might not identify what a crisis is until it's too late. I mean, we have more abundance, more feasting, and less famine than we've ever had in human history. I mean, we have it really good. So our problems in our first world are not the world's problems. And often we see through a skewed optic. And when we talk about awareness, a lot of it has to do with this agreement and collaboration with society that we are going to outsource everything. We're going to outsource education, healthcare, security, all these things. I mean, as we speak, the FAA just shut down all airlines, which is the first time it's technically done that in human history. And the second time only in recent history that they've actually shut down air traffic since 9/11. And that was caused by software glitch. So if you think of the idea of putting all your eggs in one basket, we've certainly done that. And all it takes is one misstep to fracture all those eggs. So we've bought into this idea of being optimized and efficient, but we've sacrificed our ability to be adaptable and contingent. And so when I talk about awareness, it's, hey, be aware that all the things that you've outsourced actually depend on systems that are very fragile. And this word fragility is great because it's not just our individual circumstances or our situations in our towns, it's society as a whole. I mean, 55,000 power stations exist in this country, and the estimates by the government, who assessed this security test, determined that 9 to 12 of those power stations, once compromised, could shut down power to the entire country for up to 18 months. I mean, how fragile are we that we are sending billions of dollars, over $100 billion now, to a foreign war, a proxy engagement against a foreign power, and we aren't dealing with our own infrastructure in any way? I mean, you have snow, rain, basic natural disasters, which are causing major issues and costing lives because the infrastructure is outdated. It just happened in Mississippi, where the water system's so outdated that they got too much rain, which that's water, and it shut down the water, and they had a boil order for weeks. And that's not going to get any better because the entire infrastructure is decades behind. So awareness is realizing in your own life, in your own way, you could have self-reliance and start to take back some of those things. And this isn't a new novel idea. This is something that's been discussed throughout history. I mean, I got a magazine sitting in front of me that's a survival mag from 1987 that literally talks about overlanding and mobility, because you need to be able to bug out when the time comes. So we're just regurgitating things that have been thought about many times over. I just think the acceleration of AI, of social media, of media period, of the internet, we are amplifying that potential. So only a couple steps away from catastrophe. And I want people to be aware, but I also want them to be tangibly prepared.
Yeah. So the Fourth Turning was written in 1997. So this is before even 9/11 happened, which was, for many of our generation, quite definitional, because it led to me joining the military. I didn't necessarily join out of like, oh, pro 9/11 patriotism, or not pro 9/11, but like I didn't respond to 9/11 patriotism because I joined the Army in 2008 when I graduated high school. But the fact that 9/11 happened meant we went to war, meant I had a military to join because I wasn't going to join in peacetime. And so the Fourth Turning warns about potential things happening, but it can't predict it. It didn't have the awareness of what the internet would become. The 2008 crash led to millennials coming to adulthood in a time where your college degree didn't seem to be worth anything. And then at the same time, Instagram and social media arrive. And so an entire new generation and genre of jobs are created with influencers and with the social issues that came out of some of that, with like the diversity issues. Then we started seeing the rise of HR as like a new department, and people created new jobs. And so we can look at like American populations and say they're adaptable. But when we look at our individual skill sets and survival, I think what the Fourth Turning really does point to is that when we're talking about continuing on as a people, we're not necessarily just talking about what's in your pantry, even though that's a necessary element of it. And so I wonder what you would think of if you were to take the mentality of us as people, because I've been familiar with your American contingency. I don't want to call it a project. Your program. It's more than that. It's your community. I've been familiar with that for a little bit of time now, especially after seeing how it was handled in 2020 when everything was a militia, and even further, how you would address like our community survival and our cultural not survival. It's our cultural like progeny. There's a word I'm looking for, and I can't really think of what it is on my hands. But there's a word I'm looking for. Is like how do I take what I have learned here and move it into my community and move it into other places in a way that functions better than, say, proselytizing. Like I want people to be a part of the survival movement. It's like I want my neighbors to be okay and have like their kids to be raised in a world where they're not being confronted with the massive crisis of meaning that results in predatory activities by people in education or wherever that would take advantage of a child's innocence and need for something. I'm not a parent myself, so
Yeah, I think one of the issues that we have is obviously the immersion and saturation of technology in our world. And often when we have technology so integrated, we look at our phone and have virtual connections, but we lose the tangible connection, even in our own backyard, right? I mean, I see more people nowadays more adverse to actually meeting and talking and engaging in person than they are, because they're more comfortable with sending a DM or a text. I mean, even in my own habits, I don't like talking to people on the phone because I got TBI. So I want to reference the talk and the conversation on a text so I understand in reference the 150 people I'm talking to on my SMS. I have the ability to kind of partition that outside of my head, so I have some optimization there. And so there's a good and there's a bad. When we look at community efforts like American Contingency, societally, as most of your listeners might know this, but I was listed a domestic terrorist organization based on my ability as a Green Beret, in quotations, because that's how it was written in an article, to evolve and develop my own militia, which I think is comical because it feels a little bit like a degradation when you call me a militia, because we're so much more. A militia is good at small unit tactics and shoot, move, communicate, but we're very strategic in what we do because we're trying to grow assets in your own backyard and get back to basics. When I grew up, I joined the Army in 1997. And when I grew up in the 80s, community watches and neighbors was a thing. I was raised by the town that I grew up in and the people on that block. Everybody was a mother and father, and they kept eyes on the kids in the neighborhood. We were a tribe. Now we're not a tribe. Now we're singletons who think because we have these virtual connections, we could survive. But the bottom line is we can't survive.
Yeah, we need that. We do need that human element of it. So how have you, this is a bit of a, I can see it work out this way, is that I can sit on a show like this where it's going to be it's going to be, you can view it anywhere in the country. In fact, most places you can view it across the world. And I can say things like, participate in your local elections. Right. And that has a certain flavor to it, but then I won't do it because I'm here. My job is to tell other people to participate in their local elections. And there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. And I'm saying this with the attempt to look at the things that I'm saying and then the things that I'm doing and try to solve where those inconsistencies are. So I recently moved to Arizona, and as a result, I'm not around as many people that I know. And so I do spend a lot of time on the phone. I spend a lot of time on Instagram, and I spend a lot of time DMing and scrolling and talking to people. And part of that is one of the main distributions of this show is through Instagram. So there's a certain work element to it. But let's just say when the combination of TBI and depression hit at the same time, I have to get out of the house to find somebody to talk to. Otherwise, I kind of keep imploding until my wife has to tell me to grow up. And I'm very thankful that I have people around me and I have friends in the area. We didn't move completely to foreign spots. So how do you as an individual, and how does Mike Glover solve the problem in Mike Glover's life about being too focused on technology and the memes and the things that people say and the comments and the negativity and the whatever? Because we kind of don't care about the drama as much anymore. I know gun culture still has its drama, but I'm going to just go out and say it. Like, if your business model is based on drama, you've got a short timeline. So
yeah, well, you get it. I would say, I mean, personally, what I do is I prioritize what's important in my life versus what's not. And here, I'll tell you a truth. The truth is I don't have an addictive personality, and I know that. And the truth is I know a lot of people who have addictive personalities. So when I pick up a phone, the dopamine that I get versus the dopamine somebody else gets, and what we do with that is very different, because I have the discipline and probably not the propensity, maybe even genetically, because I don't have a lot of addicts in my gene pool. I'm able to put it down and walk away, whereby some of these actors, because what they're doing is certainly acting, are addicted to it. They get a little bit of dopamine, and then obviously the more emotion they arise, the more dopamine they get. So they just get caught up in these echo chambers, and it's a vicious cycle. And I've seen people lose relationships, jobs, and a lot of friends by doing that. So me personally, I go into it like it's my profession, and I go into with a couple principles that I adapt and adopt. One, I only am positive, because certainly there are a lot of negative things that you could derive from social media, but there's enough of that. You could find that anywhere. I choose to put out things into the world that are positive. Second, I won't socially engage with anybody that's negative, because most often there's no context and no sound argument. A lot of it's just talking crap. And then third, I had the discipline to understand, if you get into that, because we are self-critical, because we are curious by nature, because we fiend for the dopamine, it is a vicious cycle that will destroy your mental capacity. And I can't afford, like you, most likely, to destroy that fragile system of me rebuilding that part of me over a 20-year career span, where as a priority, it wasn't me, it was everybody else. So now it's time to focus on me. And I encourage people, one, to never engage or follow anybody who's negative. And two, in your own life, use social media for the benefit that it is, because there's many benefits. And three, have the discipline to know when to put the phone down, because your kids are more important than your social media following.
Yeah, very much so. So I don't know how much Strauss and Howe or the Fourth Turning would have predicted the impact of social media on our culture as a whole. Let's just say American culture, especially not on like how gun culture has functioned, because I've heard it said a couple of times that the internet saved gun culture in America, because it got all these individuals who are spread around the country to have some way of connecting to each other. Now, when it comes to social media itself, you said you do not follow you avoid kind of negativity. What do you like? Can you not give me an example tell me a story of some time that it happened, but like, what do you mean when you're talking about negativity? Because I can think of positive criticism where someone's saying, hey, you said this, it didn't make sense, I need to understand it better. Or I can think of a troll who's telling me that, well, you can't be a real ranger with that haircut, or something ridiculous like that. So like, how do you separate the two? Because we need to be able to, we know we want to be able to give positive feedback, or we want to be able to give criticism to each other. And we want to make sure that gun culture doesn't kind of stray into the live, laugh, love section, where we just give each other positive affirmation for things that are non-substantial. But on the other side, this whole negativity concept can become ambiguous, and I'd like to make it a little more solid, at least for the remainder of this conversation.
Yeah, that's easy. I'll give you two personal examples, one for me personally and one for my company. The first one, as a personal example, a segment of a video that I filmed a year ago was put out on Free Range American, which is a subsidiary of Black Rifle Coffee. And it was a video called Pro Tips on Dry Firing, or dry practice. The clip that they posted took a sentence or two from the actual video that was 13 minutes long, posted on YouTube. And it said basically, in a nutshell, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the script. It said basically, if you're dry firing, you're dumb. But that's not what I said verbatim, but essentially it was taken like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the context of the video was dry practicing is just as, or if not, and more important than dry firing. So the act of dry firing on a pasty, which certainly after a long career in special operations, I grew up doing. What I didn't realize is just doing one thing, one action of cycling my slide and then dry firing on the wall on a pasty. There were other things that I could do in dry practice that could make me just as efficient. Now, this isn't ultimately my expertise. This is the culmination of a long special operations career, getting trained by the best shooters in the world over that career. Because often special operations reaches out to guys like Kyle Lamb, Todd Jarrett, Robbie Latham, Dan Horner, Max Michel, the list goes on. And so I think the general consensus is if I take dry practice and implement it into my skill sets, which is not often talked about because you can't virtue signal on your Instagram account that you dry practice, because most of the time it's the person taking the pistol, dry firing on whatever it is. I've seen a lot of people develop bad habits. I know this because as a company, we train 10,000 citizens a year. And personally, I train hundreds of people a month. And so on my ranges, I have a lot of people, I would say 20 to 30%, at least a third of the class doing things like pushing their pistol and after breaking the shot, immediately racing the gun back, or even holstering the pistol, which I don't allow people to do on my range because I want them to keep the gun out because we're in the middle of a firing line and engagement as part of the curriculum. So this pushing the gun out and then pushing it back, or pushing the gun forward and then dropping it down, those are all actions that are rehearsed and practiced that have become what most people would understand to be muscle memory. Well, the problem in that is you could develop training scars and habits. That's accepted in the industry as a phrase. These training scars can lead to bad habits in the middle of an engagement. Just because you don't do it on a flat range, normally, what I've seen is if you introduce stress, those things come out because you're referring back to your level of training. You're not necessarily rising to the occasion like you would expect. So that criticism came with people saying the 2A community wants to know, and that for me is acceptable when remaining professional. But when memes start coming out and all this stuff starts coming out, I'll let the people who know who I am fight those wars, because they came out and said, hey, if you just watched the video, dummy, then you wouldn't have this argument. But again, you're reading headlines, not understanding the context and the discussion. And that's often a mistake made by a lot of people, but I wouldn't expect that from professionals that I used to respect in the industry, who I think would know better. And that's just a prime example of me personally. As a company, I have on my staff Kevin Owens, retired Master Sergeant who used to run SODIC, Rangers, unit guys, SF, SIF snipers go through SODIC. I'm SODIC qualified, and I was a SIF sniper. He ran an organization that trains the best snipers in the world as the non-commissioned officer in charge. So he's got experience. He also was in force modernization at the GA at USASOC, U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and was in charge of developing weapon systems and optics and ammo, and brought the 6.5 Creedmoor to the military. Also brought that ammo to the military. He's the guy who submitted the initial CONOP or concept for the 6.5 Creedmoor. We posted on Fieldcraft Survival's page that 6.5 Creedmoor has double the hit probability over 308 at 1,000 yards, and immediately started getting attacked. Now, when we posted that, we obviously knew that if you grew up with the 308, which I certainly did, because when I went to sniper school, we were shooting M24 SWSs, sniper weapon systems chambered in 7.62 by 51. When you have a 308 person who grows up in that field, in that space, when they hear something like that, they get emotionally charged. And if they would have read, again, the context of the entire post, as referenced, Kevin Owens, Fieldcraft Survival, and Mike Glover didn't say that because we didn't assume or make an opinion based off of not having the facts. Brian Litz, who wrote the book Applied Ballistics, which is probably on this bookshelf behind me, is the one who did the test for Special Operations Command, and using an algorithm and using data was able, the environmental factor we can't account for is obviously the wind. But after every test in models, the 6.5 Creedmoor has double the hit probability of 308 based on the internal, external, and ballistics. And it's science. It's fact. It's not debatable. It's not arguable. It's the reason why the military adopted 6.5 Creedmoor for Special Forces snipers or Special Operations snipers over 308. But again, taken out of context, everybody has their opinion and they mass. And some of these opinions were from people who own companies that made custom rifles. And again, whatever their incentive was, they're like defending themselves and their persona in their company, not realizing that, I actually said one of the guys, because I called him because I had respect for him. And I said, listen, did you read the post? And he said, I did read the post. I said, do you know who Brian Litz is? And he said, yes, I know who Brian Litz is. I've eaten dinner with Brian Litz. I know who he is. And if he saw this, he would be disgusted. And I said, then you didn't read the entire post, because as referenced, anything we put out like that, which would be seen as a broad assumption or opinion, we want to back it with fact, especially science. And he said, let me read the post. And he read the post and he felt like a dumb A. And he got off the phone with me apologizing, but still sticking to his guns because he was so emotionally invested in that argument. So I think overall, this is the issue that we see. Smart, intelligent people. I would assume most conservatives would be more rational and logical than people who are leftist extremists, who seem to be more emotional. But for the first time, you have people who seemingly are driven by facts are more likely to adopt opinion and make things up based on a headline. That's concerning for me. And I think for the first time in the history of our lives, without the understanding of the fourth turning with social media, it's coming to a head. And I'm like, man, wow, I've been called a bootlicker and a white supremacist in the same week by both sides of the extremes. And I must be doing something right because I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. So I guess part of that relation, let's go back to the 6.5 Creedmoor versus 308 thing. Like there's a certain element where you have to look at your friend. Ooh. Well, I think there's road construction going on in my neighborhood because we lost internet connection again, but I think we should be good for now. Mike, so the last thing that we were talking about, I wanted to go back to this. You told a story about Fieldcraft Survival's interaction with 6.5 Creedmoor and its performance measurements that are being produced by through the military, and talking about, what did you call it, like hit probability, which I imagine is a technical term. It's not like, oh, it's more accurate. It's not, this isn't Call of Duty level accuracy. This is saying like, well, I guess me knowing what I know about the military, it could either be a complete bullshit statistic,
True,
or it could be something that's like legit, like really real. Like it could be like, troop efficiency in the, garment department. And you're like, yeah, what does that mean? Well, we got more blind people sewing. Like, I don't know what that means. So, but the point that I would say is that, like, okay, so you have this interaction with this guy who did not receive the content well. And I imagine that there's an element of you going, buddy, we're on the same page. We're in this together. And I don't want to be, and I don't want to be the guy that's just, oh, you disagree with me, throw you out. And quite honestly, I don't think many of us do that. I when it comes to gun culture, I am optimistic. We see the trolls, we see the anger, we see the frustration, and hopefully, and I think, this is something that I'm optimistic about, hopefully we're starting to see a bit of our generation as we kind of take on the mantle. I mean, you certainly have, but as we take on the mantle of gun culture, we bring with it the maturity that we're hopefully gaining and saying, you're going to get over, even if it's not public, it's, hey, you're going to get over this and then we're going to be just fine. But sometimes we have to kind of go through the garbage of human interactions, because we're humans. We make emotional reactions, and sometimes it's not related. I'm not saying that everyone gets a free pass all the time, but that is a challenge that social media does not seem to handle well. Is that since I have an infinite record of everything that you said, I can go back and find something that you said, get angry about it, and say you're dumb, and then go back to whatever I'm doing. And at the end of the day, I accomplish nothing. But when it comes to, we see people who just read headlines, we see people who just make assumptions, we see people who interpret something for what it's not, or maybe we're not as good at communicating as we want to be, or we're working on a product and a project that's a little bit bigger than our ability to see at that time. How would you approach the issue of, there are people who you will never break out of just reading headlines. I understand that. And sometimes I don't want to develop in myself some sort of savior complex where I can be like, oh, if you just read the article, you would understand everything going mentality, as opposed to diverting my energy towards things. And I don't mean this in some sort of like foo-foo way. We're not in the crystal place up in northern Arizona with the vortexes and stuff. But it is like, I want to make sure that we are able to focus our energy and our time on things that are a little bit more beneficial to other people in our culture.
Yeah. I think a lot of people forget in their own virtue signaling, and I virtue signal as much as anybody else on social. I think anytime you talk about your virtue or position or stance, you're doing that in a way. But it's unfortunate that a lot of people who do that, a lot of people who talk poorly of others, who get controversial, they don't realize in the allocation of their time and their energy, they're investing a lot of it in something that's not doing any good in the actual position. I would venture to ask many members of the audience who have these passions and feelings and opinions, especially about the Second Amendment, who have actually got involved in legislation for the Second Amendment. My company protested, without advertising that we protested, an ordinance here in my local county. I'm involved in legislation where I talk to my congressman often because I want to know, what is Utah doing to protect its sovereign, law-abiding citizens from all of these gun control measures that are affecting the country, including today, Illinois, that just voted to ban all assault weapons, a myriad and laundry list. So I wonder if anybody out of Illinois who is invested in these arguments and debate were actually invested in fixing through legislation things that would tangibly make a change. Now, people forget, a lot of people complain about the federal government. And I talked about this on Jack Carr's podcast recently. I believe the name of it is what's the name of it, John?
That's the problem with us naming our podcasts. That's the problem with us naming podcasts off of like military references, like Danger Close, Clearing Hot. Yeah, you're like it's the you're waiting for the ASVAB podcast and the, oh man, are you gonna be on the DD 214 podcast? Nah, man, I'm really not into that one. I'm really just into what's the hand receipt that you have to have your sign out every time you sign out something. What was that called again?
1099 or
no,
yeah, 20.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
but it's like
1099. Yeah,
it is I thought 1099 is like, it has to do with money, but whatever. You get the point.
Yeah.
It's yeah. So it's, But it's you're 2047, 93, and you're like, yeah, I'm so lost. And then you got some guy who's like, I want to be in the military, and they're just speaking jargon, and you're just 3 minutes into the podcast where we're just like, yep.
I was on not the Cleared Hot podcast, Jesus,
Danger Close with Sir Jack Carr himself.
Yeah,
first of his name.
We were talking about all the things that are going on in this country, and a lot of people talk about the federal government and all the issues that we're facing, but not a lot of people actually understand that the federal government doesn't have a lot to do with overall gun control, because the Constitution protects those things, like enacting lawsuits that Federal Circuit Court of Appeals shut down for weapons bans, including the attempt for the federal government to enact or reenact the assault weapons ban. But states, including 9 states in this country, currently have an active assault weapons ban. So the federal government could say, yeah, you can buy whatever you want, but the state that you live in, including Illinois and California, could say, you know what, you can't even buy a firearm. Oh, and by the way, if you own it, like Illinois' position, we are going to make you register your semi-automatic rifles, which are declared assault weapons, with the state, which is a huge constitutional infringement. And so we have the power at local levels, including with your local mayor, your governor, hell, your local PTA, to be able to affect change in all these things that we've outsourced. These people work for you. So I would just encourage in this conversation, people who are thinking about this, if you spend a lot of time in the echo chamber circling the drain, man, take some of that time and take some of that profound energy that gets you fired up and do something about it, right? Redirect your energy. Because I feel like the 2A community is not really banding together as they should. I try to be an advocate and a leader in the community by saying, hey, I'm going to be this way. And if you want to follow me, then we need to do these things. While other guys who have profound capability and experiences are saying, follow me, we'll circle the drain together. And at the end of the day, we won't be better as a country, a community, or certainly as a 2A community.
Yeah. So this is where a lot of this generated is. Like, we can spend a lot of time talking about how to become a better shooter, which has its place. And I can sit here and as a philosopher, argue and consider more and more why something like the Second Amendment is a necessary concept, or why it's maybe necessary concept for those who are engaged in academic philosophy will know I just made a horrible contradiction. But what I'm saying is we can argue about the cogency of, or the legitimacy, or the reality, the metaphysical reality of the human right to self-defense all day long. But it becomes biblical in the sense that in the New Testament it says faith without works is dead. It's not arguing that your works give you salvation. It's that if you don't act on what you believe, you don't really believe it. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do here too is I'm seeing through conversations with yourself and with other people who come on the show and with the community as a whole, is like there is a pretty major gap between what I'm advocating for and what I'm actually doing. And there is no shortage of information out there. The books have been written. There can be more, but the books have been written, like The Fourth Turning, like De-Infringe, like maybe Anti-Fragile by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, like these, all these different, somewhat philosophical elements where we can get all the information we need. But what we need now is courage. And sometimes that courage on the community level means swallowing a little bit of pride and saying, okay, I'm going to try to figure out how to make this work. And then sometimes that courage means I need to go to that meeting that I don't want to do, and I have to participate in public speaking in a way that I'm not comfortable with. But it's good to do that. It's good to take ownership over your country. And when we talk about some of like the Yuri Bezmenov style leftist infiltration of the country, it almost appears like, well, I don't even want to say it. It's very rather obvious that there is a concerted effort within our country to take people who have the values of who have a certain set of values like individual responsibility, liberty, ownership of their own community, which means picking the trash off the street in front of you. It means taking care of your neighbor even though you don't like them, taking care of their needs when they need it. Not like I'm feeding you and clothing you, but like, there's a tree that has a branch and you're an elderly person. You can't cut it. Maybe I can help you out, kind of stuff like this kind of stuff. Oh, now it all got derailed. I think there seems to be a concerted effort to take what we call virtues and call them vices, call them evil. Take what you and I call good and call it evil. I would even argue that was what took Minneapolis, is that because we left Minneapolis. My wife and I left the state of Minnesota, but the sad state of Minnesota at the time was that it felt like it quit. It gave into something that it no longer concerned itself with rising crime. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my perspective is too shallow, but that's the best way that I could describe it, is that like it was disheartened and subjugated by something. And in our day and age, and as we're looking at something like the fourth turning, we're reminded that our survival, not in the little tribe of whatever with the fires and the fishes, but our survival, the extension of our virtues into the next generations, requires something of us as a culture that may not look pretty. I think that the fourth turning expected that the millennial generation was going to be what they referred to as the hero archetype, which in some sense was a little bit dutiful. It was a little bit self-sacrificing, or it was a descent from individualism into more focus on institutions, maybe a shift from hyper-focus on the individual, your personal expression, whatever you want, which we could argue there's a lot of that going on right now, to something more like for the community, for the culture, for the institution, for the academics, for the school, for the church. The shift was going to be away from hyper-focus on the individual and towards the community. And when it comes to millennials, we can see I think you can argue that we can see that hero archetype was in a sense followed through with. We had millennials join the military, even though there weren't as many casualties as other conflicts. Millennials in force joined the military. And then many of those millennials got out of the military to go start businesses and try to start families. Millennials obeyed the lockdowns for the greater good, or whatever. Millennials wore the mask for the greater good. Millennials did the thing for the greater good. In many ways, our generation did the dutiful thing, just not in the way that we expected it. And now we have to look at, as a culture and as a country and as gun culture and as individuals and as families and as communities, what kind of culture we want to survive this crisis that we're in. And that I think that was the big takeaway I got from this book, is it wasn't kind of a kumbaya about, well, we're going to have an apocalypse, because you missed the point. I think we're starting to shift. We need to start to shift our attention to not kingdom, but what high, what do we want the high to look like? The next high, instead of hoping that the apocalypse weeds out all the bad eggs and then opens up an opportunity for, the steadfast righteous man to like wade out of the ash with his laser gun and his dog and his family of 4. It's like a fantasy that doesn't exist.
The thing that struck me, even with the years that this book was written, and then the time of publication, and also the prediction of 2008 and beyond, which puts us right in the middle of the crisis, is that there was no guarantee that after the crisis we were going to have a new series of events, that we were going to actually come out of this. Mm-hmm. every single voice that I pay attention to understands the difficulty and circumstance that we're in. And it's weird because people historically have said this before. I imagine guys like Hackathorn and his peers from Vietnam and the guys who wrote the original articles in Soldier of Fortune were kind of looking at the world the same way. But collectively, even moderate and sometimes liberal voices now are going, man, something has got to give. It looks like it's going to break. And that's concerning. That's alarming. I mean, when you see an application like Chat GPT that could write a 60,000 page novel, because in machine learning and generative content, it's evolving rapidly. What does our future look like when we've outsourced ourselves and when everything that we've built looks at us like a liability and not an asset? And, you know, we again are doing this in capitalism in a great country that's the most powerful country on the planet. But what does it mean when it breaks, when it actually fractures, when it's too good? And I'm concerned, but I'm also optimistic about people's abilities, especially regionally, in their own community, that can band together in these tribes to be able to lean on each other. Now, that requires leadership. That requires they get outside the box. It requires structure and task organization, all those good things. But man, populations across this country, like in my backyard in Utah, are amazing. But I just came from Seattle, where it's not so amazing. I mean, it looked like I was in Solder City again. And so I'm optimistic about the future, but a lot of this in our future is up to the individual states and the individual peoples of those states. We're decentralized. A lot of people think we're centralized. We are very decentralized, which is the point, I think, of the founding fathers, to decentralize powers. So when we talk collectively about the fourth turning could be actually the infrastructure that is the government. Like I hear people talk about going to war with the government. I'm like, that war would last 15 seconds. Like, are you going to go to war with politicians and congressmen and Biden? Like, I don't even know what that means. So when we actually say the collapse, it could be the democracy that we hold near and dear, but the strength isn't found there. It's found in your own backyard. At least I think that way.
Yeah, well, there's a very important statistic. I was out at GBRS Group a long time ago, maybe about a year ago, and it was there where it kind of dawned on me that I know that's a bit of a name drop, so I apologize for participating in the algorithm. But one of the things that I mean, you know, I saw something there that, and there was something that was going on, and maybe it was the situation that I was at the time or where my headspace was at. But I came to a realization that all of the people who are really good at violence are not participating in it. And this was after 2020 and in the midst of 2021. And so you had, there were still dumpster fires in Minneapolis, and there were still things going on. It was like, and there was this revelation of like the people who are really good at violence are not participating. They're not going out and doing the violence. Or if they are, they're gainfully employed or pointed in a direction that's external, which, for better or for worse, you can talk about imperialism and grand social narratives at another time. When it comes to conflict in the United States, especially this idea of civil war, the big challenge that I keep running into is what for? Like, the Civil War is not going to give you a sense of purpose. When you talk about rising to the occasion or dropping to your level of training, rising to the occasion happens in the quiet moments. It's organizing your mind into what you believe in, and it's organizing your mind into the things that you consider true and valuable, and understanding values and pursuing things that you find valuable and ingraining those into your life, because you don't go to war for you shouldn't go to war for a sense of purpose. I was even reading like Chris Hedges, who wrote the book War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And while I don't necessarily agree with, well, just about anything the guy has to say, the interesting thing that he keeps seeming to argue against or argue for is that these people went to war looking for it to give them something. And that was a sense of meaning. And if nothing, that's the grave warning of our day and age, is that the social conflict of the race riots gives us a sense of meaning. The social conflict of the protests seems to give us this sense of like, I'm a part of the thing. And we want to tell a narrative that like, well, the evil manipulators are just using the puppet people to create the problem. But we fail to recognize that those people lack meaning and lack purpose, just like our people lack meaning and lack purpose. And I myself occasionally encounter times where I am directionless and aimless. And I think that is where we rise to the occasion, is in the now. You build the people and we build each other, and it's not going to be pretty, and there isn't going to be a black multicam edition of it, and there isn't going to be some form of what's the word I'm looking for? There isn't. It's not always going to be as simple, but this is where we rise. We rise in the now and how we think about things and how we engage with each other, and we stop complaining about social media controlling us, and we instead remember that like social media is one part algorithm, one part people. And I run into it all the time where like my pet peeve on Instagram is that I am tired. I am not tired. My pet peeve on Instagram is softcore porn. And like, it's that where I'm going to go, I look on any of the pages, the discover page, and it is what it is. Like it's a solid pet peeve. And part of me wonders how much of the algorithm and how much of the people behind Instagram are driving that. But part of me also recognizes I am a human being in a culture that values certain things, and I may value different things. And so there is a challenge that exists within that environment. So I can't always change the algorithm, but if I get that opportunity, I'd want to address it. But I can be a part of society. I can't commit the psychologist fallacy and have the view from above where like I'm looking down on social media and it's things like I am a part of that thing and I have to work within it and live within it. I'm a part of society. I'm not a societal mechanic. I can't tweak the tools all the time, but I can push in a direction. So
yeah, a lot of people use social media to present themselves to the world in a better light. I mean, they want reaffirmation. That's a normal psychology, and it's just a normal part of our human behavior. Unfortunately, the priorities in which we decide to spend and value our time aren't focused on the things that necessarily matter. I mean, a lot of people who we think have themselves together or seemingly together are in very bad situations, and they don't have their houses in order. They don't spend a lot of time with their kids. I know people who spend 4 or 5 hours a day. I mean, it's now on your screen time on your cell phone. I mean, if you spend 4 to 5 hours on social media and you're not doing that for a profession or a living, that's a problem. And we're little drug addicts for this phone and for all these social media apps because it gives us all that chemistry. I just hope that people understand, like, there are better ways to invest our time and doing really good, like developing and evolving your family unit, like raising good children and good people. I mean, that's a real cause to get behind, but you can't necessarily tell the world about because it's hard to virtue signal that you're raising your kids right and actually doing it, So I think we're in a very slippery slope here with social media. Because as we talk about Instagram, for example, they're the ones who are making the billions and billions of dollars to get more adaptive, to react and respond to people's behavior to make more profits, while we are being driven by an algorithm. I mean, people's behavior in Minneapolis and Seattle and all over the country to burn it down mostly came from the influence they got from the app, whether it was Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, whatever. They saw the video because the algorithm favored the emotion. It got them fired up and they hit the streets. And it's like, man, I mean, you talk about being a puppet and we talk about the concept and the idea, but it's like you're literally being manipulated as a puppet because you're just on the tail end of the strings. You're not the puppeteer. You're the puppet. So again, all this is awareness, and it's good to understand, because even if you just reallocate a little bit of your time and you get more involved in your community and you spend more time with your kids and you realize, hey, Mike said on that podcast, I'm spending too much time on my phone, and you put it down, that's a good step in the right direction. But I'm just not so optimistic that humans overall, at least in the majority, are capable of making those sound decisions and being that disciplined. A good statistic for that is 110,000 people this year versus 107,000 last year overdosing on fentanyl and other drugs. Mm-hmm. Homelessness at a record high, crime at a record high. The list goes on. Those are all systemic symptoms of a bigger issue. And likely it's going to be proven in the future that this was part of the equation.
Yeah, it will be. Like it is. I think that the metaphor of the Black Mirror is very much so. Like I haven't seen the show. I don't have the connection, but the idea of the Black Mirror being like, it reflects back at you both the Nietzschean abyss and your fairy tale Barney world. And that is kind of the horror of it. And so, I think when Nietzsche was talking about when you stare into the abyss, it stares back, is that you start seeing how much of a monster you are. Mm-hmm. And it is the process of undergoing that pain and still finding the courage to pick yourself up and make one more day out of it, where you start to find wisdom. Where it's you can't live in the naive world where, I think we've been around long enough that everybody knows that Instagram to an extent is not real. Like, not everybody, but we know that it's not real. Like, it's and when we take it so personally that what somebody posts on Instagram isn't real, or when somebody argues something that isn't something that's clearly doctored as real, it's frustrating because it's lying about reality. But what that ends up, I think the tragedy of what we're seeing is we're seeing somebody that's controlled by the algorithm instead of them being a part of it. And it is a tragedy. It isn't like, I'm no longer offended by it. I find it really tragic. Especially when I find it really tragic when people are controlled by the drama. It's like, man, you get a hate mail, and it's like, man, you could have been something. You could have been something, but now it's going to be, well, good luck, I guess. Like, that attitude's not going to get you. It's not that it's not going to get you. It's just, it's tragic. So but we're doing better. We are, and I'm not saying something super profound there, but I am recognizing that. With optimism, or the optimism that I'm seeing in gun culture, is with all the bad stuff that we see, I do see good. I do see good happening. There is a shift in gun culture. We are growing out of our isolationist and atomized attitudes. It's not that we're just trying to become some sort of homogenous collective, but sometimes it's good to sit down and be grateful for something. Without conducting yourself into that live, laugh, love flippancy. So, well, we've got about, let's kind of, I don't know if we could pivot a little bit. We could pivot this conversation. We can finish a little bit more on the fourth turning. I want to make sure that we're in the last maybe 20 minutes of this show, and I want to make sure we have some time to kind of deliver a little bit more or a little bit deeper. Is there anything else about the fourth turning that you would want to that really stood out? Because I have a notes here, but is there any other parts that really stood out within our day and age, like that applies to today? Maybe something practical.
Yeah, the only thing that's standing out for me that's profound that we haven't talked about is this doesn't mean apocalyptic. This doesn't mean end of days. This means conflict, right? And this conflict, like we came out of World War II, didn't directly involve people on the ground necessarily in America versus fighting the World War overseas. But it did change our history, and it did change how we came out of that event. You know, I can't imagine if we didn't have the surge coming out of a Great Depression and a pandemic in 1918, that we would have been so strong as a country, surging this military industrial complex and all of the aspects of innovation, all the aspects of technology, all the aspects of building our country back. I mean, people were going to work, and certainly there are negatives associated with the military industrial complex, but certainly there are positives. Like, we surge our growth. I mean, there's a reason why we are one of the most advanced countries in the world. Not necessarily with technology and software, but at least hardware wise, we are big thinkers and big innovators. So with that bad comes potential good, but it doesn't have to involve like the end of days. And if people recognize that, they would understand how important it is to vote for the right people and the positions that are going to make decisions to potentially lead to that crisis. Because culturally, if we're coming to a head with so many subcultures going to war on social media, and that leads to a person who's forefronting the decisions for that culture, their team, they might not represent the entire country, and that could be problematic. I mean, I look at Ukraine and Russia, for example, as a really scary thing for people who understand war. All it takes is a couple decisions or indecisions to lead us into a World War III, which could be very bad for us as a country. I mean, we already have troops committed, pouring billions of dollars. It could take $100 munition to make its way over into Poland to start a world war that involves us. And it's like, did we vote for that? Did we have buy-in for that? Well, if you voted for the wrong person, you did. And if you're not getting involved in legislation, you are. So I just want people to understand that it doesn't have to be this zombie apocalypse to warrant the crisis or catastrophe. It could be an overseas world war or a proxy lead up to a world war that creates all this chaos and calamity as predicted in the fourth turning. That could be the fourth turning.
So do you think that us as veterans are prone to assuming when we think of the crisis as a Moscow, where we're like critically crippled, and that assumption could be misguided? Is that how you're saying it?
Absolutely. I think that's spot on, because I think we have a lot of misassumptions, even about getting involved. Like, yeah, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to grab my M4 and I'm going to go to work. No, you don't have the capability to do that. In fact, you would be better served doing what you potentially are an expert at. I mean, it's like the idea that everybody on a special forces detachment and all their specific jobs is going to be kicking in the front door. If you're a commo guy or a medic and you're kicking in the front door, you might be better served on a ridge line talking to higher or talking to close air support. You might be better served being in the back of the stack as a medic, because we want you helping the people who are up front, who are in harm's way. So when people said, hey, Mike, is American contingency going to war? I said, I don't even know what that means, but let me lay this out for you. No, the answer is no. Where you need to be is not the streets of Minneapolis or Seattle. Where you need to be is standing in the threshold defending what you love most, because that's where you're better served. So even when I look at my position, as a sergeant major from Special Operations, if I was on the ground, especially at USAFIC, Special Forces Command, that was a problem. If I was like kicking in a door, I would be better served negotiating with air assets, communicating to commanders, driving the tactical operations center from a command and control perspective than I was throwing a flashbang into a courtyard. So I think we have to understand that what we think a campaign or a battle or a conflict or a civil war is going to look like is very different now, which means if you want to fight, if you want to be part of doing good because you want to fight, stop thinking about the easiest aspect of this, which is picking up the arms and going to war. That's like the easy. start thinking outside the box and enabling and supporting and using your skill sets on the computer in education and legislation. That's going to have more profound impact anyway.
Okay, yeah, I think there's it's interesting. Okay, so I got to think about that one, because there's a bit of a balance that I think I grew up in the video game generation where everything is to an extent, everything is seen kind of like a role playing game where you've got your mage and your healer and your tank and your whatever. And so when I think of like a team of guys, it can be easy to default to this idea of like each person having a role where they have a role as a part of the team, which is partly true and partly false. One of the so with your argument here that the idea of existing in a war is not everyone picking up their AR-15 and going to work, because, well, even we know that that's not true. And just like in the gun control political debate, well, not just like, but what we've learned from the gun control political debate is that all the people who know anything about guns and anything about shooting are not allowed as part of the conversation. Case in point, the people who are defining what an assault weapon is don't know what a caliber is. So like, it's really hard to take them seriously. And we might be coming from, let's just say, the high halls of military academia in its own joke to that level. But what we're saying when it comes to what I understand what you're saying when it comes to like know your role, do what you're good at, play your role kind of thing. It's don't masturbate your ego with the idea of going to war with a gun when you refuse to participate in your own community in the way that you can make an impact now. That's what I hear as a warning. Is like look out for where you're. I see the apocalypsism as a form of like, well, for lack of better words, ego masturbation of like, when the apocalypse happens, I'm going to get my dog and samurai sword and we're going to go win the war. It's like that. I think that perhaps the crisis is going to be a little bit more Blade Runner 2049 than it would be, Fallout 4 or whatever the video game is. It's going to be a little bit more like the crisis might be, we have the food, the infrastructure, the buildings, the police, but we have no sense of purpose, and any acting out in a sense of purpose will be crushed. And that I would find that much more horrifying than, zombies and monsters and whatever. And World War II or World War III is an interesting one, because I don't know how to think about that. I think I want to say that I do, but I really don't. Like, I don't know.
One of the points is, I think it has to do with your priorities at work. I mean, as a ranger, especially, when you go into a fire base, there's a focus for a purpose because you're looking at statistical probability. I mean, the statistical probability of you being in a self-defense action using your firearm from appendix carry is not even close to the extreme circumstances of trauma and utilizing a tourniquet or a Band-Aid. I mean, you could do both sides of the spectrum. So when we practice, when we invest our time, what is the time we're investing? If I had a team guy on my Special Forces detachment who was really fit, but he didn't shoot very well, well, then I would reallocate his time if he didn't do it for himself to commit more time on the range. And then I might even partition his time to help everybody else focus on how to be better at being more physically fit. So a lot of people show and demonstrate their abilities to shoot, move, and communicate. I would say exclusively shoot, less move, less communicate, than they do doing things that statistically have a higher priority in our priorities of work. So I just think, when you look at the slippery slope that is the situation in Ukraine, for example, with Russia, we again have outsourced all of our decision making because of this social agreement, this collaboration, and it's coming from our resources. We work hard to pay the taxes because we trust the person doing the thing. But I think institutionally now, a lot of that trust is compromised for a lot of Americans, even myself personally. So I am insourcing a lot of those things and focused on my own backyard before I'm focused on Washington, D.C.'s backyard. Because again, in the priorities of work, there's only so much I could affect in my sphere of control, my sphere of influence. So I'm going to start there at the 5-meter target and work out from there. Where a lot of people are talking about the 1,000-yard target, but they don't even have the capability to hit it.
Yeah, as like an emotional reaction, one emotional reaction that I had to the fourth turning was looking back at time and seeing it as kind of a breathing in and breathing out. That this is not the first time people haven't trusted their government, and it's not the last time it'll happen. And this too will pass. Like, we will move away. We will eventually, in theory, and this was kind of like the moral that was not beat. This was the moral that was kind of coming out of in the back of my head about it, was this idea of, if it is true that the cycle of the fourth turning is prescriptive, then we will most likely live until the next first turning begins. And we will see the return of strong men and a respect for institutions. In other words, we should not look at the crisis that we are in, we should not look at the crisis that we are facing and see it as apocalyptic, but rather see it as, what do we want ourselves and our children to grow out of this into? And that changes the mindset from, and you've seen this too, and you certainly know it, the idea of like a defensive mindset is not the same as a mindset of somebody in panic, where a defensive mindset was really trendy a while ago, and it still has its place. But the idea of mindset is not so much figmenting these ideas of what I'm going to do and how I'm going to Bruce Lee my way out of this. It's entering into a crisis and being able to orient myself towards improving my position and where I'm going. And the best reaction that I got out of the fourth turning is kind of pulling out of this defensive, shutting down, isolating reaction to the crisis that we live in, whether it's Minneapolis, whether it's the country as a whole, whether it's the border crisis, whether it's Joe Biden's glorious competence, whether it's the potential of World War III, and saying, okay, I can't fix that, but I can do this. And I can try to say, look, I can't fix the school system, but I do want my children to be raised a certain way. I can't, but it is a learning experience, but we're back on the clock.
Awesome.
So let's come to a conclusion. Let's kind of wrap this up. And I don't know where you lost me.
I heard everything, but probably the last couple sentences of what you were saying about the fourth turning.
Okay.
About
Yes.
Doing your own good in your own way.
Yeah. So like, I think that the thing that encouraged me, the thing that I took out of this, that was at the end of the day, like something I could work with, and something that I could be encouraged with, is that like, I have things in control of my own life. Like I can focus on my friends, my family, my community, my children. I don't have any kids right now, but these kind of, this mentality of, the world will rotate out of the crisis. And so like the crisis, as far as human experience goes, you can take like the Christian religious thing way far. You can engage in the apocalypsism, but apocalypsism is nothing new. The Gnostics in circa 95 AD were talking about the end of the world, just in the same way that the climate change people are talking about the end of the world, in the same way that some of like the charismatic Christianity is talking about the end is nigh. Like, it's not it's not the issue that the end will come that's the problem. It's the issue that I think we take with it, or at least I take with it, is the kind of artificial imposition of meaning that's implied by the urgency of the moment. When you go from in Cooper's color code, no affiliation or no relation. When you go from like white to red, or from like mild to more intense concern, that's not a good way of saying it. When you go from not passive but like aware to assertive, you get the chemical rush, the adrenaline, the focus, when the bullets start flying in a gunfight, you don't think about taxes. You don't think about all the noise, and you don't care about the Joe Bidens and all the stuff out here. You think about what's in your control. And that can be really addicting because you don't have the noise. You don't have all that chatter that's going on, that's nagging you in the back of the head. But the problem of the addiction of it is in that same way, when you enter in and this is my experience, maybe I'm the crazy one, but when you enter, every time I've entered into a gunfight, the world's gotten quiet and focused. And so that feeling wears off over time, but it doesn't wear off back to like normal. It wears off into exhaustion. And the idea of how we approach the fourth turning, the pending apocalypse, the climate crisis, or whatever you want to talk about, because I mean, I think by now most of our issues with the whole climate change thing is not the idea that it may happen, but the people who are talking about it. I think the issue is that we use that as like it's like candy, like it's a drug, it's an adrenaline rush, but it doesn't have the long-term fruit that we need. You need to have both at the same time. I can read the fourth turning and say, oh my gosh, the crisis is going to happen, but I can also read it and say, the crisis will pass. What future do I want to see for my family and my community and my friends? And try to change my mindset even a little bit towards that. So,
yeah, I think that's a good way to leave listeners understanding that there is something tangible that you could do, right? I mean, most people are paying attention to what's going on, but most people aren't consciously involved in things that are going on. And as you described, like war for me was simple. It was fun. I mean, those are words that I would describe as war, not tragic. War for some people is tragic, but war for me was not that way. No. And I think a lot of people who potentially talk about wanting that, they're missing profound purpose in their lives in other ways, you know. And when you're sitting and staring at your phone, and then the life you want, you're fantasizing about online, and that actually doing something like, I don't know, getting your pilot's license like I'm doing recently.
Nice.
Skydiving, camping, taking your family out, and, you know, being a better father or being a better man, whatever that is for you. Those are things that feel, for me, better than war, better than conflict. Raising my kids makes me feel better than that position I was in, because civilian life often sucks. I mean, if you're living in a life of mundane routine, then it sucks. So we look for it in social media. Well, stand up on your own, start your own, I don't know, American Contingency Group, and start developing these skills. And when you live that lifestyle kind of preparedness, what we advocate for is all the problems that you had, now you're consciously focused on things that are going to make you better and your community better. That's a life worth living in this country. Don't just sit by the phone and wait for impending doom because you want more purpose. Actually be proactive in your life.
Well, life is not a movie where you buy 40 acres and have, you know, Sean Connery come down in a helicopter in your backyard saying, hey, we need you to build a team to go save the world. It sounds cool, but like the real hard work is in the day to day. And there's something to be said about pursuing that. So, well, in closing, I know that I heard around, I think I saw something. You have a new book coming out, or has it come out already?
It's on Amazon for pre-sale, but it comes out June 6th.
Okay, so it's on its way. All right. Well, I look forward to adding it to my library. But you know, Mike, thank you very much for coming on the show today. I think you've definitely, you know, made an impact in our culture. But where are you moving? Where do people find your stuff? Where do they go? How are you found?
I think the best way is just to find me on YouTube at Mike Glover Actual, which is just catchy because Mike Glover's taken. That's where I post most of my content that's not suppressed, and where I spend most of my time.
Okay. I would laugh pretty hard if somebody was trying to use my account, but now we're back on another version of it. I hope it didn't just lose everything. But needless to say, Mike, thank you very much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate you being here, and I thank you for taking the time to sit down and have a conversation with me about something that required work to get to. And so, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope to have engage with you more in the future, and we'll see. Maybe we'll find ourselves sharing a nice glass of bourbon sometime or something.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. For all intents and purposes, thank you very much for following us. Thank you very much for listening in the conversation, being part of the evolution and development of gun culture in America. You guys know how to support us. If you do, you head over to redactedllc.com. That's where you're going to find our merch. Other than that, we really just appreciate your time. We're a self-running operation here. So take care. See you soon.